Hello everyone and welcome to Oxford Policy Pod, the student podcast from Oxford School of Government. My name is Cristian Iftodii and together with my colleague Marc Naro, we are delighted to have joined us today by Professor Sir Paul Collier, who is a professor of economics and public policy here at the Blavatnik School of Government. Professor Collier is widely known for his influential work on poverty, fragile and conflict-affected states, migration, and economic challenges. He's author of several best-selling books, including Left Behind and The Future of Capitalism. Professor Collier, thank you very much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for inviting me.
Professor, you grew up in Sheffield, one of the poorest cities in the UK, raised by parents who didn't attend university. You then came to Oxford and went on to become a professor here at the School of Government. After 5 decades in academia, shaping both scholarship and policy debates around the world, this is your final year teaching here in Oxford. Looking back, what has given you the greatest sense of purpose in those years?
Well, that's a big question, but actually it's pretty straightforward to answer. I'm an old guy, as you say. This is my last teaching year, and so it's my last chance to build a succession. And everybody who's doing anything of worth, when they get as old as I am, they should have put in place some form of succession. And so my proudest achievement, without a question, is that on all my work on global poverty, I built a very fine succession, which is Professor Stefan Durkheim, who's now jointly a professor here in the Department of Economics, where I used to be. And he's streets ahead of where I am now on this subject. So any question that comes in about Africa, poor places, left behind places around the world, I know where to send. I send them to Stefan. And that is a hugely satisfying thought for somebody who's stepping down from teaching. I've done my job. I've built a succession. I thought until recently that I hadn't done the same thing for poor places in Britain, the Sheffields, where I started. I should say when I was in Sheffield, it wasn't a poor city. It was a prosperous city. It was a steel city. The steel industry collapsed and Sheffield spiraled down. And I've at last found a really good, worthwhile successor who's going to take that forward. And so I retire a happy and relieved man.
Awesome. Actually, we had Professor Stefan Durkheim at the Oxford Policy Pod a few weeks ago, so we invite everyone to watch the episode. It was a good, very good conversation. So recently you said that one of the biggest economic risks is not recession, but it would be that people no longer believe in capitalism and in the reciprocity of capitalism, particularly in those left behind places. Does that mean that we've been focusing too much on growth and not enough on fairness?
Yes, I think it does. Though I think the two are by no means incompatible. If we look at the most successful societies in Europe, we don't have to try very hard to think which ones they are. They're certainly not Britain. They're the Nordics. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland. I think the most amazing of them is Denmark, because, and I know Denmark pretty well, but it's bleak and cold, has no natural resources at all, and yet it's a hugely successful place at every level. It's got the most successful company in Europe, Novo Nordisk, just amazingly successful. And which but it's all got a very equal society. It's very high tax, but people pay those taxes because there's so much social mobility. If you're born near the bottom, like I was really, it was, as you say, both my parents left school when they were 12. Can you rise to success? In Denmark, there's so much social mobility of people at the bottom rising to the top, but equally of people at the top falling down, that the successful people, the people at the top, know that some of their grandchildren will probably be more nearer the bottom, in which case they better make sure that the bottom isn't too painful. And I think that's one of the things that really underpins the fact that Denmark can have a very high level of taxation, far higher than Britain, and yet it's still a really fast-growing country. The majority of people in California, which is, supposedly the most successful region in the world, the majority of people in California will be absolutely better off if they lived in Denmark. So that's the sort of model. Now, it's not easy to become Denmark, but they've done it, I think.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Like you argue here and also in your book for higher taxation in order to support the left behind regions. But in a world where entrepreneurs have very high mobility and they can move to other countries with lower taxes, do you think that it's still a possibility to have higher, smarter taxes here in Britain, but also to assure that these people don't leave to other countries?
That's a true difficulty. And again, I'm going to return to the Nordics. I mean, Britain is worrying because our tax level is not, to be honest, that high. If you think they're high in Britain, as rich people do in Britain, they think it's high. If they move to Denmark, they'd be skinned alive. But on the whole, the rich in Denmark don't move. And because they've managed to internalize two things. One is that the Danish government spends money pretty effectively. And it's a very inclusive society in terms of participatory politics. So it's very devolved, both politically and economically. So there are poor parts of Denmark and rich parts. All of them are pretty prosperous. So that's one thing. But the real thing is that because there's such a consensus in the society, I think a rich Dane who fled would feel a bit guilty. In Britain, rich people don't feel that the money's well spent. There are all sorts of scandals of disastrously incompetent public spending, of which the funniest, although it's a tragedy, is what's called HS2, High Speed 2, which is the rail system, which is a complete fiasco and total embarrassment. We might come on to it later again. But that lack of confidence in how Britain spends money can be contrasted with the ability of the Danes to spend money, and the leadership in Denmark is very inclusive. Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister, is a single mother who left school at 16 and lives an ordinary life. And so when she says we to fellow Danes, we have a duty to do this, they listen and say, yeah, that is a duty. When Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer or whatever, the myriad of prime ministers we've had say we. The people in the poorer places, parts of the country, say, there was a famous little exchange when George Osborne, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer a few years ago, a rather good one, but he went to the northeast of England, a poor region, and bragged about how rapidly GDP was growing in Britain, which it was at the time. But somebody in the audience said, "That's your GDP, not mine. Here in Newcastle, we're poor and we're not growing." And it was that sense of alienation, that was a killer line, because he was quite right. It wasn't his GDP. It was fast growth in London, slow growth in the north. So that's a long answer to a good question. But I think it's building that sense of mutuality which grounds people in the country, even if they are going to pay high tax. The wealthy in Denmark are looked on with pride because they've done something and they've paid a lot of tax. Whereas the wealthy in Britain are looked on as borderline criminals because all too often they are.
You say that one of the problem in Britain is maybe the fact that the treasury is crazily elitist, and that with the fast track streams, it's only, I mean, you require a lot of network within the elites. So how do you think that should be reformed to create a fair system of accessing the highest positions?
I mean, the real killer, and you're quite right. I mean, we've had MPP students go straight in, whoosh, into the Treasury as their first job, and loads of economics students. They do the MPhil, and whoosh, their first job, fast-tracked into the Treasury. And the Treasury in Britain has far too much power. It doesn't trust anybody else but itself to spend money, and its whole mantra is we must not waste taxpayers' money. That's its mission, which it inherited from Victorian England. That was its obsession then, and all these years later it still is. We must not waste taxpayers' money. And that is indeed a necessary condition for legitimacy. But it's not a sufficient condition for legitimacy. First of all, manifestly, we are wasting money. HS2, the fiasco, wasted staggering amounts of money. Something well north of £100 billion, with nothing to show for it. And so it's wasting money. It's not demonstrated the competence to handle things, and it's not surprising. And the whole model of the Treasury is we will deliver prosperity to you. If you're familiar with shopping deliveries around Oxford, there's a firm called Ocado which delivers things. They come to our house once a week and deliver things. You can't deliver government policies through a system like Ocado. Ding dong at the door. Here we are. You ordered a good health service. I'm afraid there's been a substitution this week. A good health service isn't available. The substitution we got is an assisted dying program. Will that help? And so on and so forth. The centralized attempt at delivery completely fails to understand how a growth process works. growth process is much more a bubbling up through experiment at the bottom. Britain has a series of city region authority mayors. It's got about 20 of them now. They're politically responsible for their region, but they've very little money and no powers. So they can do little, but if the Treasury were to trust them more and give them more money and powers, not just for 1 year, but longer term, then that would be a start, because the mayors would each be responsible for designing their own program to help their community grow in an inclusive manner. And they would do different things in different places. Now, that would be a huge benefit, because we would get experiment and variation. The Treasury, quite rightly, knows it can't introduce variation and experiments, because it's got to treat every place the same. That's a sort of condition for a sense of fairness for something that's delivered from the top. We'll deliver the same everywhere. But that, although it's a necessary condition for fairness, it's not a sufficient condition. It's not spending money competently, we've already seen, but nor is it achieving this sort of variation of growth. Why is variation so important? Because of what's called radical uncertainty. I learned about radical uncertainty by writing a book with John Kay, who was the pioneer of the concept. And radical uncertainty is where you really don't know what to do. Governments hate admitting that they don't know what to do, but they need to. At the moment, we face so much uncertainty. Certainly in Britain, we don't know how best to grow Manchester, how best to grow Newcastle. And the best thing is to let them try and figure out what they think is best. They're a network group of mayors. They'll be watching each other, sometimes collaborating with each other, sometimes competing. And that variation will be the process that drives our learning. We'll learn what works well, and that's the best process we can have. Maybe later on I can talk to you about examples from elsewhere in the world that have actually did that.
In China, with Deng Xiaoping, I know you talked a lot about the deconcentrated system in China, with many regions implementing their own policy, and they look to each other. They see what's going well, what is successful, and they take the example. So maybe if you want to draw this example.
That's a perfect example, which is and the achievement was Deng Xiaoping, who came to power in 1982. That was before you were born, but I remember it, right? One of the advantages of being old is if you can drag your memory back. And my wife was actually in China in the early 1980s for 3 years. She spoke Chinese, so I learn a lot just from talking to my wife about China in the early 80s. And what happened then was Deng Xiaoping in 1982, he came to power, but it was very precarious. China was dirt poor. It's almost impossible to persuade you that that is the case. It was the epicenter of global poverty. Right? Now it's not. Now it's super fast growth and all the rest of it. But in 1982, it was desperately poor. And Deng Xiaoping, the new leader, he did a few things that were brilliant. One is he went and looked to look in other countries and learn from them. He went to Singapore. He went to Japan. on the old Marxist model of Mao Zedong, the poor were being ground under the heels of the wealthy, right? And he saw that in Singapore and in Japan, on the contrary, everybody was getting a lot better off. And so he thought, let's see if we can do that in China. Let's have an experiment. And so he empowered the mayor of one of the coastal cities to try and do a sort of mini Singapore. That was one very sensible thing to do, learn from others. Right? The Treasury is allergic to that, but it would make a lot of sense. The other much more exciting thing was what you mentioned, was that he realized he got the power to appoint governors of the provinces and the special economic zones. And so he did. He appointed, he had a competition. It built on the tradition of the prestige of getting into the Chinese civil service and having a competition, but he changed the competition. It had been, do you know your Confucius backwards? And instead it became, do you know hard sciences, economics, mathematics? And then he said, you're going to be, you're eligible to take this exam if you're in the age range 25 to early 30s. And something like 20 million people competed for this exam. And then he takes the top 40. The top 40 out of 20 million. You're two of them. And I tell you, I'm dang, right? Well done. You're in the top 40 out of 20 million people. Feel good about yourselves? Yeah, right? Yeah. It's not quite that getting into the Blavatnik School of the MPP, but it's pretty close. So you do feel proud of yourselves for good reason. But then he said, okay, you're going to be governors of a province or an economic zone, special economic zone. You're governors for the next 5 years, and you've got full powers from me. Dang. You have what's called plenipotentiary powers. Your word in that region will be God. You're God for 5 years in a region, right? Where would you like to go, Marc?
I mean, it's
Off you go.
lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
You don't have experience too.
well, don't worry, because I'm going to now tell you what you've got to achieve. There's a couple of things I want you to achieve in the next 5 years. And incidentally, I'll choose the province for you, not you. There's one you've never heard of, afraid, Marc, but you're off there. One thing you've got to do is double GDP in the region in the next 5 years. The other is you've got to halve its infant mortality. Yeah. And we'll be watching you, Marc. We'll be watching you closely. Oh, and I should say, we in the Politburo have no idea how to do it. But you've got to. Still feel great, Marc?
Some peer pressure.
I would call you. I think you have the solution.
Yeah.
I don't know in that place either. But, and then he adds one little thing. We'll be watching you, Marc. I already said that, didn't I? But we really will be if you haven't started an initiative on these two things in the first 6 months, i.e. the next 6 months, because you're on a plane now, you're permanently thrown out of the top 40. And I mean, Marc, permanently. You'll never get back in. So you better go and try something, hadn't you, Marc? Off you go.
This is good incentives.
Huh?
I
What happens?
think you convinced him.
First of all, you panic on that plane, and then you arrive in a place you don't know from Adam, and you think, oh my God, I've got a halve infant mortality, I've got a double GDP. And I've no idea how to do it, nor has he. It's easy for him. He doesn't know, but nor do I. What should I do here? Well, the really stupid thing to do would be to get off the plane and say, I know what to do in this region, you're going to do it. Right? That's a road to a plane out in 6 months' time, right? So what's the sensible thing to do? If you're worried about halving infant mortality, you better go and ask somebody. Maybe you want to go and ask in a hospital. Right? Maybe you want to go ask some funeral directors. Why are kids dying? Just ask. Maybe ask several hospitals. Maybe ask several doctors. Get their views, get their ideas, and then say, oh, you try this and you try that, and I'll watch you. And I'll see which one works, and then I'll scale up what seems to be working. And you do the same with how to double GDP. You'll talk to the firms in the region and say, what's the problems? And then you'll try things. And then Deng is watching, because this is going on in all these regions and EPZs. And then he says, now what Fred is doing over there on infant mortality is really working, Marc. What you're doing doesn't seem to be working yet, does it? You might want to go and talk with Fred about his ideas, what he's doing. It might not work for you. You judge that. But I'm just suggesting you go and have a look. Huh? That was the process that worked for the first 5 years. It kept going for 8 5-year periods, 40 years, until she came along and wrecked it all. She's a top-down guy. Right? Deng and his successors followed that model. That was the 40 years in which China transformed, and we had the biggest fall in human poverty ever seen in 10,000 years of human history, So this was a phenomenal success. We could replicate that idea in Britain if we used our mayors. Will we do it? Who knows?
Thank you. Let's maybe move the policy talk across the ocean and go to the United States. Professor, in your books, you often describe the period after the World War II and before the OPEC crisis as some golden years in the West, as in this period is marked by relative unity, greater equality, and a shared sense of purpose and usefulness in the Western societies. Another person who has the same opinion is Donald Trump, who always portrays this period as the golden age of the American nation. However, your ways of restoring this period are very different than his ways. Do you think he bases his MAGA movement on some economic theory? Or, what's your opinion on?
So I think Trump made one really good move, which was to treat working class people with respect in what he said. Right? I remember a scene in one of his campaigns where he picked up a baby held by a construction worker, and he held the baby up, put a construction worker's hard hat on the baby's head, and said, "Future construction worker," and the crowd cheered. And that showed a respect for what ordinary working class people in America were doing. Of course, that was the talk. What President Trump has done is very different from that. But the talk was enough to bring along a lot of working class Americans. If you remember, Trump was competing with Hillary Clinton, who at the same time was describing, she said, half of Trump's supporters are deplorable. Well, if you're going to, Trump was polling about 50% in the polls. If you're saying 25% of and he was polling stronger in the working class. And if you're saying most of the American working class is deplorable, and you're trying to win their votes, and you're supposed to be a party of the left, you've basically insulting people, and that alienated them, and that's why she lost, I think. So obviously, Donald Trump hasn't done anything for ordinary working people. To his credit, Joe Biden did more. Biden tried to put money into stimulating the left-behind regions. Trump has developed what's now been called a sort of K-shaped economy, in which the rich people are doing better than ever, and poor people are still heading down. And that is really kicking in the teeth the MAGA group of people. And I think that's the base of support he's got is starting to realize that, and it's starting to crumble. That is starting, I think, to be recognized in the market assessments of America. So the dollar is starting to slide, the stock market is starting to wobble. So I think Trump is not pursuing an inclusive strategy. It's a divisive strategy, and it's not just normally divisive, it's bizarrely divisive, in which he's favoring a minority, the really rich, at the expense of a lot of middle America. I really doubt that's going to hold up to the end of his term.
Yes, on the same note, I think that Vice President J.D. Vance also made his career on helping poorer regions. I think he even set up a fund before being elected in the Senate to help poorer regions, I think in his own state of Ohio. So most probably this campaign or this dialogue of helping poorer regions in USA will also be the main campaign motive of the next elections.
Yes, I think Vance is actually a much more interesting character than Trump. And it's very hard to read what Vance is up to. Whether because of course he's at the moment totally in lockjaw with Trump. And I just can't, I have no idea anymore, I can't see into his head any more than any of us can, whether if he becomes the presidential candidate, he will actually dump a lot of Trump's agenda, or whether he'll actually believes in the Trump agenda. My hope is that, my top hope is that Democrats get their act together and field a credible candidate who is offering credible hope to working class people in America. I think that's absolutely vital. But if the Democrats don't do it, then it's left as a yawning opportunity for Vance to do. If he doesn't do it, then I think America's heading for America will error correct, I think. There was a famous line of Winston Churchill which said, "America always does the right thing, but only after trying all other possibilities first." So in the end, I believe the checks and balances system in America is sufficiently strong that it will error correct, as it just has done on the issue of tariffs. So I'm more hopeful of the long-term future in America than I am in the long-term future of China, because I think the top-down process of Xi, which is sort of a super version of the top-down process of the Treasury, we know can't work.
Very interesting. Another phenomenon that we see in the US, but not only, that comes with social fragmentation is the phenomenon of loneliness and depression rate that are skyrocketing in left behind places. And this has been exacerbated by social media addiction and the fact that some social media, they use addictive patterns that really trap some people in those addiction. So do you think this is a market failure? And how should the state intervene to tackle this issue of loneliness and depression rates?
Yeah, I mean, we don't need a national ministry of loneliness, that's for sure, right? We can't deliver, ding dong, it's Ocado, here's the end of loneliness, delivered to you. If you're lonely, as many people are, and the research shows that it's amongst the young and amongst the old, much more than the people in the middle. If you're in a work environment, you're automatically in some sort of community, unless it's a ship community like an Amazon warehouse, which is a hierarchy of humiliation. But most jobs are not like that. They're communities. So the working population at least has some sort of social network automatically. The people who are not in work, the young, and we've got huge numbers of people in Britain that are not in the NEETs, not in employment, education or training. They're lonely, and the elderly are lonely. You know, when I retire and our kids leave home, and my wife says, "Oh my God, it's still you here," then I might start feeling lonely.
Your students will visit.
We will visit you if you want.
But clearly, this is a problem that can be tackled not by government, but by civil society. And what we need, and we're poor at it in Britain, in continental Europe much better, we need non-government organizations, some national, but really to tackle loneliness, you want a civil society organization organized at the level of the street, level of the neighborhood. And in healthy societies, they abound with them. The German government had the very good sense to subsidize these civil associations. So, and subsidized quite heavily. There's a lot of money poured into. If you found a civil society association for any purpose, you like hunting birds, bang, bang. Yeah, you can get a subsidy to do that. But in the process, all the people who like hunting birds come together and, some have got black hair, some have got ginger hair, some have got beards, some have not got beards, some are Christians, some are Muslims. They start to mix and they discover that they haven't got horns growing out of their heads. And so these sort of cross-cutting associations develop habits of sociality. And obviously that's what we need to tackle loneliness. Somebody say, well, and there's a real big problem in isolated villages where you've got people who, the husband, typically the husband's older than the wife, the husband's died, the wife can't drive, and then she's stuck. And the neighbors are all working. And that's a problem that's tackleable once you've got a network of people who care about that. Older people who've retired but can still drive could go and pick her up, right, and befriend her. If you're lonely, what you most need is a friend, right? Now, you can buy a friend on, by getting a therapist, but that's not a friend. It's a commercial relationship. And so these are the dense networks of association that we've undermined in Britain, but in most other places they built them. We should learn how to do that.
Yes, Professor. Actually, in your book, The Future of Capitalism, you praised a lot the local NGOs in UK who worked with left behind families. You also said that you had some experience in trying to do something here in Oxford.
Yes, I mean there's a local association in my area, but of course my area is a rich area, and so it's easy in rich areas to organise. The tragedy is, which is something that Marc was alluding to, that in the poorer areas there's a spiral down, and people start to blame each other. They want to know, why is my area poor when that area isn't? And they start to blame each other. And that blame game divides them. This is what happened in Sheffield after the steel industry was hit by some very stupid government policies. And so the steel industry started to feel financially squeezed. The employers said, we can't give you big wage increases this year. The unions then in the steel industry went on strike, and that made it worse. And then as steel firms started to go bankrupt, the whole scale economies of the steel industry in Sheffield imploded. And now it's pretty well disappeared as an industry. So that was an implosion in which you got fragmentation, blaming each other, and that's the spiral down which I describe in Left Behind. And you see it again and again, not just in Britain, but in a lot of poor places around the world. And that is a tragedy. And how to build out of that is hard. At the moment, I'm working on one very poor place in Britain where its own core industry has just collapsed. And I was invited in by the mayor and the local MP. And the hardest thing is that those first steps in bringing people together and trying to overcome a wave of nostalgia to try and preserve the past. And so, you've got to come together and reimagine a future where you see what is distinctive about this place and turn those distinctive features to advantage. And I've been doing that with this place for about 8 months now, and it's starting to work. It's quite exciting.
Well, thank you, Professor. I think we could speak about this issue for hours, but I invite everyone to really read Left Behind, which is a very good book that addresses this question of loneliness and left behind places. For the last part of the interview, we want to focus more about EU, and the first question would be about Ukraine. You've worked a lot about post-conflict recovery. How do you think the international aid, the international community should focus on the post-conflict to reconstruct Ukraine?
Yes, so once again, this is something that the Ocado delivery model is really not going to work. Europe can't deliver renewal to Ukraine. It's going to have to be Ukraine which itself comes together. This is a bitterly divided society, don't forget. The genius of Zelensky was that he was a Russian speaker and a comedian, and hence a very good communicator. So he knew he'd got two core skills, which were both very useful. One, because he was able to communicate easily and fluently to ordinary people. and the other is a Russian speaker from the eastern part, he was better able to say Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers need to come together to face this threat of Russia. And so those were his core advantages as a leader. Obviously, he wasn't a military leader, and he didn't pretend to be. But he was able to see that you could. He understood what the Russian weaknesses would be, far too top-down, centralized, and so Ukraine would need a devolved response crafted from the bottom up. And broadly, that's what happened. And as a result, it's astonishing how the Ukrainians have learned to innovate and protected themselves through a very grueling period of years. It's amazing. So what can Europe do and what can't Europe do? Well, what it needs to do is deliver enough money to Ukraine that Ukraine can then finance a bottom-up process. Because renewal costs a lot of money. Some of the renewal is physical. You can see from the images that a lot of buildings and bridges and so are being destroyed. That's the minor part, the physical rebuilding. The much harder part is to encourage the psychological process of coming together to solve problems and think what, other than the physical things, the physical infrastructure, what else do we need to do? Well, we've developed a lot of skills in the military. Can we put those to use in things that create jobs other than jobs in the army? And that will require a lot of money in training, skills training. So they'll need to develop new colleges of training technology where you train people in technologies. That will be an example. And you need to encourage firms to develop that can grow fast. And so you'll need some pool or pools of risk capital so that the successful firms in the Ukraine can grow very fast. Ukraine can learn from the pools of funding that a number of countries in Europe have. In Germany, you have KfW, which is a fund that puts risk capital into enterprises in Germany. You've got a very good system in France of the collectif, which are all the departments of France. It's got 90 departments. Collectively co-own, together with the French Treasury, a fund which they jointly guarantee, which is used to lend money to the departments to do what they want to do with the money. And because it's jointly guaranteed, if they lend money to a department which makes a complete mess, all the other departments are liable to pay for it. And so that disciplines the system. And of course, each department then is determined as a matter of pride, apart from anything else. We're not going to get a reputation for wasting this money. And so they've got a strong incentive to spend money, have initiatives, but with sufficient prudence about the process that it's not stupid. I can't just buy an election by borrowing money and spending it on whatever. And so these are both the KfW idea in Germany and the collectif in France is the sort of thing that Ukraine could set up to fund the public sector initiatives in local government. And developing a strong sense of local government, not just military, that's a sort of vital step. I think it's a very exciting process, and it's the sort of thing that, if I was a Russian-speaking MPP student, that's what I go and do.
Yes. Professor, staying on this subject, in your book, The Future of Capitalism, you touched a little bit on EU, and you said one of the main problem is that EU doesn't have, the citizens of the EU do not have their own national identity as Europeans. They still have their country's identity as the main identity, which can be a problem for the EU. But do you think that the Ukraine war or what's happened with the Trump administration in Greenland can give the EU citizens some sort of identity? Or do you think that's still a problem for the future?
Well, it certainly needs to. Just at the moment, you asked me in a week where we just had a disastrous example of that not happening, because the European Commission thought that it had got a deal. First, it thought it had 220 billion euro to finance Ukraine over the next 3 years or so. Very important that Ukraine should be seen to have funding not just for 2 months or something, but it has a long-term commitment. So they thought they got 220 billion. And then I think the Spanish vetoed that and demanded an opt-out clause because it's too expensive for them. They weren't going to contribute. And then they reduced it to 90 billion, which they thought everybody had signed up for. And then at the last minute, the president of Hungary Orban said, no, I blocked it. Here's the veto. And so they haven't at the moment got any money to show. Well, that suggests to me that if Hungary is going to behave like that, it shouldn't be in the European Union. And I look forward to maybe 10 years hence where Britain is in some reformulated European Union, and perhaps Hungary isn't, if it's going to behave like that. We need these sort of coalitions of countries that understand there's a major issue here. We can't afford the Ukraine to be defeated by Russia, because if that happens, just think what Putin's going to be like. And so it's existentially important. I'm inclined to think that Europe is a bit like Churchill's remark that Europe will get there in the end, but it'll first try all possibilities. I think I'm more confident that's the case in America. Europe, the worry is, have we got the time? Because the threat from Putin to Ukraine can't wait 10 years before Europe acts. And Europe's not good at high-speed decision-taking.
So, Professor, finally, stepping a little bit away from political economy, we asked this question to all our guests. Is there a book that inspired you a lot, outside your great books that you wrote, you would like to recommend our audiences?
So, I'm going to pick two. One I've already mentioned, which is Stefan Durkheim and his book, Gambling on Development. But the one I most admire is Robert Putnam's last book, which was called The Upswing. And it's about America. And The Upswing first describes the collapse of America. And then the attempt at renewal. and it's a very inspiring book by a world-class scholar and who has taken the trouble, instead of just retiring and enjoying himself, which he'd richly deserved, he produced this magnificent book. And so The Upswing is my top recommendation.
Thank you for this recommendation.
Well, Paul Collier, thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion. From Sheffield to Oxford, and from the world's poorest countries to places left behind at home, your work has crossed continents, always challenging thinking, shaping economic policy, and inspiring generation. And I want to end with a quote from your book, The Future of Capitalism, from George Akerlof, Nobel laureate in economics. He says, "These times are in desperate need of Paul Collier's insights. The future of capitalism is the most revolutionary work of social science since Keynes. Let's hope it will also be the most influential." So we invite everyone to, of course, read those books, Left Behind, that is also here, and tons of other books that are really great to understand our world, poverty, development. So, Paul Collier, it's been a privilege to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a
thank you.
pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.